Hello everyone, Brendan Snyder here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me for this special video about my favorite top 10 albums turning 50 this year, 2023. So looking back at the 70s, it was a real watershed moment for rock. All the different things that were coming out, a lot of soon-to-be classic albums were released then. And every year seemed to have multiple landmark albums get released, 1973 being no different, the year that we are now going to celebrate. So stick around as I count down my favorite top 10 albums turning 50 this year. But before we get into it, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like, all those things help support my channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. Of course, if you turn on notifications, you're going to be able to stay up to date on all that goes on in the world of rock, just like this, with the top 10 albums turning 50 this year. So we're going to jump right into this here. Number 10 is The Stooges and Raw Power, their third studio album. It's credited actually to Iggy and the Stooges, but featured a new guitar player in it, James Williamson. And I really love the stuff that he did for the band, both with this and later on with Iggy solo and so forth. For me, the album itself focused more on anthemic hard rock than the previous albums had. Those had much more of a groove and things to it. And, you know, this one here, while not initially a commercial success, it certainly gained a cult following over the years. And of course, now is considered one of the early punk classics. I think it's a fantastic album. Do check it out if you're not familiar with it. Next one up, number 9, The Who in Quadrophenia, 6th studio album, released as a double album. Actually was the band's third rock opera. And this one here is significant for the use of multi-track synthesizer sound effects, things like that Pete Townsend was doing at the time. Also John Entwistle's layered horns. So they were getting into some different things on this one here. I think it was a pretty cool album and the direction that it took them. This one here ultimately turned into a film in 1979. So another cool thing there you could go check out. All right, coming in at number 8, we've got the Rolling Stones' Goat's Head Soup, their 11th studio album in Britain, but 13th here in the US. They had a different track listing and things like that that were going on for certain ones, and we ended up a little off like that later on, getting on the same release schedule. But this one here being their follow-up to the classic Exile on Main Street. I mean, how do you do that? You release two amazing albums like this back to back. This one here featuring the #1 hit Angie in the US at least. And the album itself was recorded in short concentrated periods of about 2-week increments. And this was all so that they could gain more of a focus on the mood for the music as opposed to how they had done this previously, and all that information coming from Keith Richards and his explanation about this album. But I always thought that was pretty cool, and it gave me a little new insight into the album. And when I listen to it, I like to think about those sort of things. Coming in at number 7, we've got ZZ Top, Tres Hombres, third studio album, one of my absolute favorites from the early period. This one became the band's breakthrough hit, featuring, of course, the classic La Grange. And now here's a cool little side note on that. And I just learned this. I don't know if you guys know about it, but the album's 2-track opening on here, Waiting for the Bus that flows right into Jesus Just Left Chicago, was, you know, the seamless transition in there has become this iconic thing that not only we know from the album, but they do it live. And that was not originally the plan on here. It was actually the engineer at the time, when he was splicing the tape, he cut too much off, and they ended up doing it this way to save the recording. And it has just become this cool little iconic thing. And that 1-2 punch opening, which I think makes this album stand out amongst all the other great albums that ZZ Top has released. Number 6 goes to Lynyrd Skynyrd, Pronounce, their debut album. This one here featured many of the band's signature hits on it. We got Give Me 3 Steps Back, Simple Man, Tuesday's Gone, and of course the all-time classic Freebird. Here's a cool thing though about Simple Man, and the producer Al Cooper for the album, he didn't like the song, he didn't want to do it, he kept trying to talk the band out of it, and ultimately, since the band couldn't change his mind, they recorded the song without him anyways. It ends up on the album and of course becomes one of their all-time classics. But had the producer gotten his way, no Simple Man. So kind of interesting there. All right, we're up to the top 5 here. Number 5 being Black Sabbath, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. fifth studio album by the band, and this one was the first time that they began to receive favorable reviews for their work, which I thought was kind of cool. According to bassist Geezer Butler, though, they weren't having any luck when they started recording this album in LA. The band returns to England, they rent this castle, they start rehearsing down in the dungeon, which I thought was kind of cool. And apparently had great atmosphere. That's where Tony Iommi wrote the signature riff that becomes the self-titled track here, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. And you know, the rest is history, as they say, but fantastic album. Guess they just weren't in the right area for the right vibe to make that classic album. I love it. Coming in at number 4, we got Alice Cooper, Billion Dollar Babies, 6th studio album. Actually became the best-selling album at the time in 1973, outdoing so many other classic albums. Hit number 1 in both the US and the UK. And here's an interesting thing. The album itself, which is 40 minutes and 51 seconds, is actually the longest Alice Cooper band recorded album. Now, this is not counting Alice Cooper solo work, but of the band, that was their longest album, which I find kind of interesting because it's not very long, in fact. And this one here has so many classic tracks that are on it. Hello Hooray, Elected, Billion Dollar Babies, title track, of course, No More Mr. Nice Guy, which I love. That's been covered so many cool times. Generation Landslide, and probably my favorite track on here, especially when done live in concert, is I Love the Dead. And the interesting thing is that the title of this, Billion Dollar Babies, would later be taken and used as a band name by remaining members of the group after Alice Cooper went solo. So a little bit extra tie-in there. And I have to say, just a little push there, this album called Battle Axe by Billion Dollar Babies is a really good album. All right, number 3, Aerosmith's self-titled debut studio album. While not really a success, you know, when it initially came out, later on in America, it went top 10 in 1975 after the band itself began to gain more notoriety for the stuff that they were doing. And the production on this one, it's very sparse. In fact, Steven Tyler even sings differently on this than he would on later albums. Yet it's still got some amazing classic tracks. You got Walking the Dog, Mama Ken, and of course, their signature tune, Dream On, which really gives a run for the money on a lot of these classic songs like Free Bird and, you know, Stairway to Heaven and all that kind of stuff. I mean, these are just some all-time classic tracks. And ultimately, you can't deny it. The album itself is amazing based on what came out of it. All right, number 2, Led Zeppelin, Houses of the Holy, 5th studio album. And this one here actually benefited from the band members having built studios. And so they could take their time and do some more sophisticated type arrangements and recordings and things like that. And what I always found kind of interesting was the quality of the recordings that were coming out of this, I think, was further supported by the outtakes that were later included on what is actually my favorite Led Zeppelin album, Physical Graffiti. And it just shows that the throwaway tracks from this album were even amazing. But then, you know, it's Led Zeppelin. I mean, pretty much anything Led Zeppelin did was amazing. You can't really argue too much with that. The other thing I was going to point out was just simply that the cover itself has kind of grown with a lot of controversy in it with the kids and their behinds, and some people calling that child pornography and whatnot. Now we have to have this label that goes over it to cover it. But, you know, what are you going to do? It was the 1970s. Okay. And the number 1 album, turning 50, that is my favorite, Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. I mean, was there any question? If you guys know me, you know I'm a Pink Floyd fanatic. 8th studio album. On this one here was a big shift from the previous 7 albums that they had done, going to some more shorter length tracks and things, and the band employed multi-track recording tape loops, synthesizers, things like that. And a lot of this that was responsible for this was actually Alan Parsons, the engineer, who of course would go on to front his own band. And of course, that's why he's kind of got that signature sound as well. But the album itself has become so critically acclaimed across the board. It's one of the most critically acclaimed albums of all time. It has spent more weeks on the Billboard charts than any other album. 963 weeks so far at the time of this recording, and it's sold over 45 million copies around the world. That's not why it's number 1, but I think it just shows that this album itself, the quality of it and so forth, and the life that it has had, the legs that it has had over 50 years to still be doing that. But in my opinion, this is an album this should be in everyone's collection. Of course, so should the other 9. But there you go. That is the top 10 favorite albums turning 50, or at least of mine, that are turning 50 this year in 2023. And I hope you guys enjoyed this. Of course, there's a lot of others. One that I left out, David Bowie's Aladdin Sane. There's so many great albums. Paring it down was really difficult. You can put your own list together if you want and give me those. Certainly let me know what you would think would be the #1 album of 1973. But there you go. Again, hope you enjoyed it. Take care. If you haven't already, please do subscribe, and I'll be talking to you all real soon. Bye, everyone.